England in the 16th century lived under a crown that promised order but delivered fear. Henry VIII ruled not merely as a monarch, but as a force of judgment, shaping life and death through his will alone. Though remembered popularly for 6 marriages and royal excess, the deeper truth of his reign lies in execution lists, scaffold records, and silent graves. His most brutal legacy was not how many he killed, but how he made killing lawful, routine, and unquestioned. When Henry ascended the throne, England still believed kings ruled by divine favor. That belief became his shield. Any challenge to his authority was framed not as disagreement, but as rebellion against God's chosen ruler. Over time, this thinking hardened into doctrine. The king's word became law, and law became a blade that required no hand to wield it. Death could be delivered with ink, wax seals, and signatures. The Tower of London stood at the center of this system. It was not only a prison, but a warning carved into stone. Prisoners passed through Traitor's Gate knowing most would never leave alive. Executions were public and deliberate. Heads were displayed on spikes along London Bridge. Bodies were drawn and quartered, their remains scattered to erase identity as well as life. These punishments were not excesses. They were messages, and Boleyn learned this truth too late. Once crowned queen, she quickly became a liability. She was intelligent, outspoken, and unwilling to disappear quietly into obedience. When Henry tired of her, the law adjusted itself to his desire. Charges of adultery and incest were created without evidence strong enough to convince modern historians. Her trial was brief. Her fate decided before she entered the hall. Her execution was swift, but its meaning was clear. Even a queen was not safe. Power belonged to one man alone. Thomas More represented a different threat. He did not plot rebellion or raise armies. He simply refused to agree. His crime was conscience. When Henry declared himself head of the church, More remained silent. Silence was enough. He was imprisoned, isolated, and eventually executed. His death marked a turning point. England understood that morality offered no protection when law served fear. Executions multiplied as Parliament reshaped treason itself. Speaking against the king, questioning royal marriages, denying religious authority, or even repeating rumors could result in death. Monks were executed for refusing to surrender their monasteries. Nobles were condemned for association alone. Ordinary people vanished into records marked only by brief legal language and final payments to executioners. Thomas Cromwell engineered much of this machinery. He expanded legal definitions until nearly anyone could be destroyed. Yet the system did not spare its architect. When Henry's political needs shifted, Cromwell became an inconvenience. Arrested suddenly, denied defense, and executed with a botched beheading, his death revealed the true nature of Tudor power. Loyalty was temporary. Fear was permanent. Catherine Howard, young and politically inexperienced, followed the same path. Accused of sexual misconduct, she was executed swiftly. Witnesses recorded her terror as she approached the scaffold. She was buried beside Anne Boleyn, two queens united not by legacy, but by warning. Their deaths reinforced obedience through horror. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII ruled a court shaped entirely by caution. No one spoke freely. Alliances shifted constantly. Survival depended on anticipation of royal mood. The king himself grew isolated, suspicious, and physically deteriorated. His power remained absolute, but it was no longer respected. It was endured. Henry VIII left behind a nation trained to equate law with violence and obedience with survival. His executions secured short-term control but inflicted long-term damage on trust, governance, and faith. He demonstrated how cruelty becomes normalized when authority claims righteousness. His reign proved that terror does not require chaos. It thrives best when wrapped in legality. History often remembers Henry for his marriages, portraits, and palaces. But the true measure of his rule is written in scaffold wood, court transcripts, and nameless graves. His darkest executions were not moments of madness. They were policy, and once fear becomes policy, it outlives the king himself. Under Henry VIII, execution was only the final act. What came before it was often far worse and far less remembered. Torture was never officially embraced by English law in the way it was on the continent. Yet under Henry it returned quietly, selectively, and with royal approval. It was reserved not for common criminals, but for those whose knowledge, confessions, or silence threatened the crown. The rack was the most feared instrument of this hidden system. Kept in the Tower of London, it was euphemistically known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter. The name softened nothing. Victims were bound at the wrists and ankles, then slowly stretched until joints dislocated and muscles tore. Pain was not the goal alone. Submission was. Confessions extracted on the rack were considered acceptable when treason was involved, because treason under Henry was defined as a crime against the state, the church, and God himself. Interrogations were calculated, not chaotic. Prisoners were often shown the instruments before a single question was asked. Many broke without a scream. Others resisted, only to be reduced to broken bodies incapable of holding a pen, yet still expected to sign statements that condemned themselves and others. Names given under torture became new arrests. Fear multiplied outward, touching families, friends, servants, and associates who had done nothing more than exist nearby. Religious dissenters suffered particularly cruel treatment. Men and women who refused to acknowledge the king's supremacy over the church were imprisoned indefinitely. Some were starved. Others were kept in darkness. Torture was applied not to punish belief, but to force public renunciation. A recantation preserved the appearance of unity. Death followed only when silence or refusal threatened to inspire others. The psychological cruelty was deliberate. Prisoners were often held for months or years before execution. Hope was allowed to grow, then withdrawn. Pardons were rumored, then revoked. Some were told their lives would be spared if they cooperated, only to discover cooperation merely changed the manner of their death. Hanging, drawing, and quartering remained the ultimate sentence for men convicted of high treason, a punishment designed to erase dignity entirely. Women, though rarely tortured physically, were subjected to relentless psychological pressure. Isolation, threats to family members, and public shaming were common tools. Queens themselves were not exempt. Catherine Howard was interrogated repeatedly, confronted with accusations, and forced to relive alleged transgressions until terror replaced denial. By the time she reached the scaffold, resistance was no longer possible. Fear had already done its work. These methods were effective because they were inconsistent. Not everyone was tortured. Not everyone was interrogated. Uncertainty became its own weapon. Courtiers learned to watch their words. Clergy learned to read the wind. Ordinary people learned that survival depended on invisibility. The absence of clear limits made every man and woman a potential criminal. What made Henry's system especially dangerous was its legitimacy. Torture was not the act of rogue jailers or sadistic executioners. It required approval from the Privy Council. In some cases, from the king himself. Authority flowed downward, and responsibility dissolved along the way. No single hand could be blamed. That, perhaps, was the most chilling innovation of all. By the time Henry VIII died, England had internalized fear as governance. Torture had not become routine, but it had become acceptable when power felt threatened. The precedent endured. Later rulers would inherit not only a throne, but a method. Silence enforced by pain. Loyalty enforced by terror. Law shaped to serve fear rather than justice. And yet, even this was not the darkest inheritance of Henry's reign. Beyond torture and execution lay something even more unsettling. The deliberate destruction of memory itself. Records altered, names erased, graves left unmarked. In the next part, we will examine how Henry VIII did not merely kill his enemies, but attempted to remove them from history altogether, and why some stories survive despite his efforts to silence them forever. Henry VIII understood something most rulers only learn too late. Killing an enemy ends a life, but erasing an enemy reshapes the future. Under his rule, death was often followed by something quieter and more permanent. Oblivion. Names removed from records. Titles stripped. Bloodlines declared corrupted. It was not enough that a traitor died. Their existence itself had to be questioned. Acts of attainder became the king's most efficient tool. These legal declarations required no trial, no defense, no evidence presented in open court. Parliament, acting under royal pressure, could simply declare a person guilty of treason. Once passed, the consequences were absolute. Property was confiscated. Inheritance was voided. Children were legally transformed into the offspring of criminals, barred from titles, wealth, and often from survival itself. A single signature could erase generations. Monasteries vanished in a similar fashion. When Henry dissolved the religious houses, he did not merely seize land and gold. He dismantled memory. Libraries were destroyed, records burned, tombs opened and scattered. The names of abbots and monks who had lived quietly for decades disappeared overnight. What had once been centers of learning and continuity became empty shells, then ruins, then footnotes. Former allies suffered the same fate. Once condemned, their portraits were removed from palaces, their coats of arms defaced, their correspondence destroyed or altered. In some cases, scribes were instructed to rewrite official accounts, omitting names as though the individuals had never existed. Silence became policy. Absence became proof of guilt. Families paid the longest price. Wives were left destitute. Children grew up marked by suspicion. Some changed their names. Others fled abroad. A father's execution could shadow a family for generations. Even when innocence was privately acknowledged, restoration was rare. Henry preferred forgetting to forgiveness. This deliberate erasure served a purpose. Prevented martyrdom. A remembered victim can inspire resistance. A forgotten one cannot. By removing stories from circulation, the crown controlled not only the present, but how the future would understand the past. History itself became an extension of royal authority. Yet memory is stubborn. Some stories survived in whispers, letters hidden in walls, marginal notes in forbidden books. Foreign ambassadors recorded what English records omitted. Clergy passed down accounts orally. Families preserved fragments, waiting for safer times. Complete erasure proved impossible. After Henry's death, the silence began to crack. Reputations were quietly reassessed. Some attainders were reversed. Names returned to favor, but the damage could not be undone. Too many voices had been lost. Too many lives reduced to absence. Henry VIII's greatest cruelty was not the executioner's axe, the rack, or the scaffold. It was his attempt to control truth itself. By deciding who would be remembered and who would vanish, he placed himself not only above the law, but above history. And yet, even this was not the final darkness of his reign, because while he erased enemies from records, he also reshaped belief, ritual, and identity in ways that fractured England long after his body was buried. In the next part, we will examine how Henry's war with faith turned private belief into a crime, and how ordinary people were forced to choose between conscience and survival in a kingdom where even prayer could be dangerous. When Henry VIII severed England from Rome, the break was not only political. It was intimate. It entered homes, churches, and private thoughts. Belief, once a matter of conscience, became an object of surveillance. What a person prayed, how they prayed, and whether they prayed at all could determine their fate. The old faith did not disappear overnight. For many, it was woven into daily life through rituals learned in childhood. Candles lit for the dead. Latin prayers whispered before sleep. Small gestures that had once been harmless now carried danger. The king demanded not quiet obedience, but visible agreement. Anything less suggested disloyalty. Churches were transformed by force. Images were smashed. Shrines dismantled. Relics discarded or destroyed. Walls once painted with saints were whitewashed into emptiness. The removal was physical, but the message was psychological. The old world was being erased in front of the people who still believed in it. Those who resisted faced choices with no safe outcome. Public refusal meant arrest. Private devotion meant constant fear. Some attempted to live between belief and survival, adapting outwardly while clinging inwardly to forbidden practices. Informers made this nearly impossible. Neighbors reported neighbors. Servants reported masters. Fear dissolved trust inside households. Punishment for religious nonconformity was deliberately uneven. Some were fined, others imprisoned. A few were executed publicly. The inconsistency ensured confusion. No one could predict which offense would be ignored and which would be fatal. This uncertainty discouraged solidarity. Isolation became instinct. Executions for heresy and treason blurred together. Catholics were killed for denying royal supremacy. Protestants were killed for believing too much too quickly. Henry tolerated reform only when it served his authority. Belief itself was not the issue. Control was. Families were forced into impossible positions. Parents taught children prayers they were told might be illegal. Clergy preached sermons they did not believe. Confession, once a sacrament, became a liability. Words spoken in faith could be repeated in court. Even silence was dangerous. Refusing to speak against the old religion suggested sympathy. Refusing to praise the new order suggested resistance. People learned to speak carefully, then less, then not at all. Fear settled into daily routine. This transformation left deep scars. Faith, once communal, became fragmented. People prayed alone. Churches became places of anxiety rather than refuge. Religion no longer promised salvation. Promised survival if practiced correctly. Henry VIII achieved what many rulers failed to do. He turned belief into evidence, prayer into risk, conscience into crime. His reign taught England that authority could reach beyond actions and into the soul itself. And still, even this was not the final cost. Because when belief is policed, identity fractures. When fear governs conscience, loyalty becomes hollow. In the next part, we will look at how Henry's reign reshaped loyalty itself, creating a court where friendship was fatal, truth was dangerous, and survival depended on betrayal. Under Henry VIII, loyalty ceased to be a virtue and became a calculation. At court, survival depended not on honesty, but on anticipation. Men learned to sense danger before it arrived. Women learned to disappear into silence when favor shifted. Friendship, once a source of strength, became a liability that could be exploited, questioned, and punished. The king's court operated on proximity. Those closest to Henry enjoyed power, wealth, and influence, but closeness carried risk. A careless remark overheard in a corridor could become evidence. A private letter could be interpreted as conspiracy. Even loyalty itself could be reframed as manipulation if the king's mood changed. Favor was absolute, so was its withdrawal. Betrayal became routine because it was rewarded. Informers were protected. Accusers were promoted. Silence offered no guarantee of safety, but accusation offered possibility. In this environment, truth mattered less than usefulness. To survive, one had to be valuable today and disposable tomorrow if necessary. Counselors watched one another constantly. Alliances shifted without warning. Men dined together at night and testified against one another by morning. Trust dissolved into performance. Words were chosen carefully, then revised mentally, then often withheld entirely. The safest man was the least remembered. The king encouraged this atmosphere deliberately. By allowing uncertainty to thrive, he ensured dependence. No one could rely on precedent or mercy. Every decision appeared personal. Every punishment seemed specific. This illusion of unpredictability kept the court unbalanced and obedient. Even expressions of grief were dangerous. Mourning the wrong person too openly suggested sympathy. Failing to mourn convincingly suggested ingratitude. Emotion itself became suspect. Faces learned to mask thought. Silence became instinct. Those who fell from favor often did so suddenly. Arrests occurred mid-conversation. Council members vanished between meetings. Personal possessions were seized before families were informed. There was no warning because warning invited resistance. Fear worked best when it arrived without explanation. Women at court faced particular vulnerability. They were watched for influence, for intimacy, for suggestion. A misplaced glance or rumor could destroy reputations instantly. Queens, mistresses, ladies-in-waiting all existed under scrutiny that never softened. Proximity to the king offered power, but it also magnified danger. This culture of betrayal reshaped governance itself. Decisions were made to please, not to advise. Truth was filtered through fear. The king heard what others believed he wanted to hear. Dissent vanished not because it ceased to exist, but because it became fatal to express. By the final years of Henry's reign, loyalty had been hollowed out. What remained was obedience without trust, service without conviction, a court that functioned but did not believe. Henry VIII did not rule through chaos. He ruled through controlled instability. By ensuring that no relationship was safe and no loyalty permanent, he placed himself at the center of every calculation. Survival flowed through him alone. And yet, this system carried a hidden cost. A ruler surrounded by fear is also surrounded by silence. Mistakes go unchallenged. Truth arrives too late. In the next part, we will examine how this culture of obedience and betrayal ultimately isolated Henry himself, and how the king who demanded total loyalty died surrounded not by devotion, but by caution, distance, and quiet relief. By the end of his life, Henry VIII ruled a kingdom that obeyed him completely and trusted him hardly at all. The system he built worked exactly as designed. No serious rebellion threatened his throne. No open defiance challenged his authority. But obedience achieved through fear carries a silent consequence. It isolates the one who demands it. In his final years, Henry was physically diminished and increasingly withdrawn. Pain confined him. Suspicion surrounded him. Those who attended him did so carefully, measuring every word, every gesture. The court still bowed, but devotion had long been replaced by caution. Loyalty remained outward. Internally, it had become exhaustion. The executions, the torture, the erasures, and the betrayals had secured control, but they had also hollowed out connection. The king who demanded absolute allegiance could no longer be certain of genuine counsel. Truth rarely reached him unfiltered. Fear had done its work too well. When Henry died, there was no public reckoning, no uprising, no sudden collapse. The system endured because it had trained England to endure. But beneath that stability lay trauma, silence, and a deep unease that would resurface in later reigns. The scars of his rule did not vanish with his body. They lingered in law, in faith, and in memory. Henry VIII is often remembered as a larger-than-life figure, a king of appetite and command. Yet his true legacy lies elsewhere. He demonstrated how power can transform law into fear, belief into evidence, and loyalty into survival instinct. He proved that cruelty does not require chaos. It only requires authority without restraint. His darkest executions were not moments of rage. They were decisions made calmly, justified legally, and carried out efficiently. That is what makes them enduringly unsettling. They remind us that the most dangerous tyranny is not always loud or erratic. Sometimes it is orderly, deliberate, and convinced of its own righteousness. History did not forget Henry VIII, but it remembers him uneasily, not only for who he killed, but for what he taught a nation to accept. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more dark, twisted tales from history.